Shepnaz podcast begins now.
You're listening to the Shepnaz podcast, a podcast by Shepherd Church. Everything we do here is to connect our community in a meaningful relationship with Christ, and we're expecting great things. My name's Joey, and I'll be your host today, and we are on the other side of the 21 days of prayer and fasting. And so today, we'll be diving into our current sermon series, Money Matters, Biblical Stewardship. We've got Rob Paul in the studio today to help us see what the Bible says about stewardship and generosity, about what God is calling us to, and all starts right now. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. And I know what you're thinking. That's right, I can read your mind through the podcast waves. You heard that we're talking about money, and you're getting ready to hit that button, go over to another station, maybe turn on a murder mystery podcast. I'm going to tell you, don't do it. I promise that I feel like God's got something good in store for us. We've got Pastor Rob here to help us today. So Rob, say hey to everybody.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining in.
Yeah. Before we jump in, would you help ease the anxiety of the listeners because they heard we were talking about money?
Yes, we will not be collecting any pledges or asking for any donations at the end of the podcast.
Yes.
Not at all.
Yeah. Because we have wonderful sponsors. I'm just kidding. We don't have any sponsors.
Yes, Mountain Dew.
But if somebody would like to sponsor us, call us, let us know.
Wait, where's the Mountain Dew cup?
It's a 7-Eleven cup, and I don't know if they're ready to sponsor us either.
Gotcha.
So, but it's here. It's off camera. All right. Well, hey, let's just jump in. So a couple of weeks ago, we started a series on Money Matters before Faith Promise.
Yep.
And so let's talk about what it looks like, what stewardship looks like, kind of give us an overview and maybe recap what we talked about, and then kind of jump in where you want to be.
Yeah. So the series is Money Matters, and we're talking about biblical stewardship. And we kind of started this series off by talking about how much Jesus talked about money and possessions. And you might think, well, in the grand scheme of things, Jesus would talk more about things like faith and prayer or heaven and hell and those kind of things. But the truth is that Jesus himself in the Gospels talked more about money than faith and prayer, and more about money than heaven and hell. And when you think about faith, you think that those are the things that really matter. Like, I want to have faith, I want to pray, I want to get into heaven. But Jesus talked more about that. And I think the reason is because there's a direct correlation between our faith and our beliefs about money. And so we wanted to just really spend some time talking about money. In fact, 66% of all the parables that Jesus talked about in the Bible concern the right or the wrong use of material possessions. Mm-hmm. And so, he talked a lot about money. As I was kind of prepping for the messages and stuff, one of the commentators that I read talked about, the crowd that Jesus spoke to. And Jesus was traveling, from town to town in rural areas. And most of the people that Jesus spoke to were poor. I mean, there were obviously rich people there as well, but most of the people that he spoke to were poor. And I think that it's interesting that he spoke as much about money to poor people as as the other things. And so everything's connected to money. In fact, this week I'm working on the budget for the church. Our fiscal year ends. Working on some other things, and I was just sitting at my desk and I told Joe, I'm like, man, if I just had money, I could do everything we wanted to do. We could. There's a lot of things we would do.
Listen, I caught myself getting a pop at the gas station and looking at the jackpot and thinking, all right, so if I won that, here's what I would do. The problem is I've never played the lottery. I've never had a scratch off. It's like you can't win if you don't.
Well, if you're a pastor and you play and you win, you have to tithe 20% of that. Everyone else,
I was planning on doing
10.
More. Just so we're clear, my math was working out pretty good.
You can't turn that in for professional expense, by the way.
Every church I've worked at was getting quite the lump sum. But I was like, but you're right. We just think if I just had more money, right? Yeah. And it comes down to it at the end of the day is, it does.
It's managing what we have.
It's a big part of
of what and it's not just organizations or churches or businesses. It's us. It's like, if I had more money, we would redo our driveway, or we would, wear different clothes or something. I don't know what you might do with more money, but at the end of the day, it's about managing what God has entrusted to us. Mm-hmm. And I'm just blown away by how often Jesus referred to money. In fact, when I was studying, I came across this, that Jesus used money to teach not just about money, but tons of other things. Like he referred to investments to illustrate the importance of investing in the kingdom of God. Yeah. He used indebtedness to illustrate the importance of forgiving. He referred to hiring procedures and wage structures. He talked about farmers who leased their land. He discussed capital and investments and banking and interest to emphasize our responsibility to use the gifts that God has given to us. He talked about money lenders, interest, debt cancellation, storing grain in our barns or using it. He talked about architectural planning and building and construction and cost analysis. He talked about how to find lost money. He talked about wealth and estate planning and spending and changing our hearts. He talked about bad financial management, dishonest debt reduction. Talked about the rich man, the poor beggar. Talked about people who fasted and tithed, and talked about the sin of dishonesty and greed. He used those illustrations to teach spiritual points as well, because our finances is so interconnected to everything that we do in our life. So really, really interesting how he did that.
Yeah.
We have also a resource that we made available on Sunday that we'll make available, continue. And if you would like it here on the podcast, it's all of the verses in the Bible that have to do with money and possessions. There's actually 2,350 verses that talk about money, and it's a resource so we could get to you. Just email us at podcast@shepnaz.org, and we'll send it out to you, electronic version of it. But he talks about money all the time, and again, just because it's so interconnected to our lives.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into some of the reasons why we think that money is talked about so much in the Bible. But before we do that, let's take a quick break so that we kind of break up the listening for people, and we'll be right back.
Great.
If you haven't taken the step of baptism in your life yet, we want to invite you that on February 5th, you could take that step. Baptism is a moment in which you're able to say that Jesus has changed my heart on the inside, and I want to proclaim it to the world. If you'd like to sign up for baptism, you can do so by filling out the Connect card, letting us know that, or you can go to our website, and on the right-hand side under Contact Us, you can click the link that says, I want to be baptized. The pastor will reach out to you, and we will get that scheduled. Each month, our church gathers for an intentional time of prayer. Ignite happens on the first Tuesday of every month. We begin with expectant worship and then move into a time of prayer led by Pastor Rob. February 7th is the next Ignite from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. Plus, we've got programming for your kids. We'll see you here at Shepherd on February 7th for Ignite. All right, welcome back. We're talking about stewardship and about money, and I know it's sometimes uncomfortable to talk about, and I know that I've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of people tell me the reason that they don't want to be at church is because they feel like all we talk about is money. But the truth is that when we look at the Bible, honestly, it's talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Like it's not something that Jesus shied away from.
Nope.
There was this quote that you gave a couple weeks ago on Sunday that I really thought was important. You said, unless we dethrone money in our life, we cannot enthrone Christ. Would you help unpack that for us and maybe connect that to like what happens when money becomes this sort of idol in our life?
Yeah. That's something I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow, but one of the things that Jesus said is that you can't serve God and man at the same time.
Okay.
And the reason is because there's only room in your heart for one person to lead. And so many times we make that money rather than God. And what we should do, obviously, is make it God, and then the money follows. Here's another thing that Jesus said in Matthew 6:21. It's the Message version, but he says, it's obvious, isn't that the place where your treasure is the place that you will most want to be and end up being. Mm-hmm. Or you probably have heard it say, where your treasure is, there your heart is also.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about that is that Jesus said, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. But it seems like it should be the other way, that where my heart is, that's where my treasure should be. But Jesus didn't say that. He didn't say that. He said, where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And so what he's basically saying is that our heart follows money. Money leads, our heart follows. And so it's really super easy to tell what's important to a person based on where they spend their money. You can see what's important to them. We can say that this is important to me, or this cause or that cause or whatever it is important to me. But if you don't support it with your finances, if you don't support it with your time, you're really just saying something that's not true. But when you invest in it with your finances, when you invest in it with your time, then you care more about it because you put a part of yourself in there, and there's a level of ownership that exists that didn't exist before. So when Jesus said it, our heart follows our treasure, not our treasure following our heart, which seems like that's the way it should be, but it's totally opposite.
Well, in the same way that we tend to shy away from talking about money because we don't like that, even though the Bible talks about it a lot, when you say, well, you have a lot of people that say, well, just follow your heart. Well, the Bible's actually pretty clear that that's a terrible idea too.
Yeah, bad idea.
Jeremiah 17:9 says the heart is deceitful. Like we don't like, because we don't know how to control that and what we let in there. We were talking about before we came on today for the podcast, I was sharing a couple of quotes that I found with you, and this one from John Wesley. John Wesley is kind of a theological forefather for us at the in our church, kind of someone we would develop a lot of theology from. And he says he talks a lot about money too, but this is what he says about it. He says, "Money never stays with me. It would burn me if it did. I throw it out of my hands as soon as possible, lest it should find its way to my heart."
Yeah.
And when we talk about giving, and we're going to talk more about giving on another episode coming up, but we talk about that money can really just grab a hold of our heart, and we depend on it.
Yeah.
And I think after we just had these 21 days of prayer and fasting where we're trying to depend more on God than on other things, what we're talking about is getting to the place where we don't depend on ourselves, which is really what money is. It's us trying to fend for ourselves, depending on ourselves, and depend more on God.
Yeah.
And take it off that throne and let God sit on that throne.
Yeah. Well, Solomon talked about the foolishness of allowing our possessions to become our obsessions.
Oh, yeah.
Right? He said, Solomon, if you're not familiar with who he is, wisest man in the world, richest man in the world, God blessed him in incredible ways. And he said in Ecclesiastes, he says, "Those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. The more you have, the more people come to help you spend it. So what good is wealth except perhaps to watch it slip through your fingers? People who work hard sleep well, but whether they eat little or much, but the rich seldom get a good night's sleep. There's another serious problem I've seen under the sun, and that's hoarding riches harms the saver. Money is put into risky investments that turn sour, and everything is lost in the end. There is nothing left to pass on to your children. We all come to the end of our lives as naked and empty-handed as on the day that we were born. We can't take our riches with us." And so, I mean, if you kind of narrow that down, he's basically saying the more you have, the more you want. Not a great way to live.
Yeah.
The more you have, the more people will come after it. That's not encouraging. The more you have, the more you realize that it does you no good. The more you have, the more you worry about it. The more you have, the more you have to lose. And the more you have, the more there is to leave behind. So that's not like super encouraging, right? I ran across this quote. It's from the Wall Street Journal from an anonymous person who said that money is an article which may be used as a universal passport to everywhere except for heaven, and a universal provider for everything except for happiness.
Yeah.
Man, that's so true. And yet that becomes the chief aim in our life, to get that, to get something that won't get us into heaven and that doesn't give us happiness. Where it seems like as Christians, our goal would be to find those things that can bring fulfillment to us, which is not money, and make it into heaven, which you can't get into heaven with money. So we just kind of turned the whole thing around a little bit, which is interesting. So I think the bottom line, before we go too far today, is that when we have wealth, I mean, the best thing for us to do is to figure out how does God want us to invest it, because if you can't keep it, and it's going to leave you at some point in your life, whether you die or whether you lose it or a recession hits, or whatever, it's best for us to choose where it goes now by investing it in the kingdom of God, and that's what we can do. We can send it on ahead. That's why Jesus said, "Don't store up for yourself treasures here, but in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy," and something along those lines.
Yeah,
So,
very good. Well, can you give us a glimpse of what we're going to talk about tomorrow? So we talked today a little bit more about the idea behind it. What are we going to get in tomorrow as we keep this conversation going?
Yeah. So on Sunday, I preached a message from Matthew, the parable of the talents, or the three servants, and it was kind of allegorical about wealth and ownership and stewardship. There's another, Jesus, again, we talked about how much he talked about it. There's another parable I just want to talk about, parable of the shrewd manager, which is kind of interesting because there's a twist in it that Jesus praises a guy for some things that seemed like he shouldn't get praised for. But when you look at it, it makes a little bit more sense. And so I want to just kind of walk through that a little bit tomorrow. Just another story that Jesus told about managing the investments or managing the resources that God has entrusted to us.
Awesome. Well, hey, so don't miss that. Be sure to subscribe. But that's going to do it for today on the Shepnaz podcast. Wherever you get your audio, make sure you share this with a friend. We'd love for them to see it, to hear it. We're expecting great things here. We hope that you'll continue to join us. As always, you can learn more about what's happening through our app, our social media pages, and at shepnaz.org. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joey. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.